what we want to do tonight, I want to kind of use Candyman 2021 as sort of a jumping off point, because I remember, I don't know if some of y'all who saw my trailer reaction to Candyman 2021, and I was excited for it, but I noticed some of the, and I kind of expected some of the comments I was going to get under it, which was kind of this immediate, oh my gosh, here's going to be another woke horror thing. They're going to ruin the original Candyman, so on and so forth. And it was just very interesting to me, the whole debate. Like, there were actually like response videos to that trailer reaction, which was funny to me because I was actually on the side of the movie, and it was weird because I felt like some of us were agreeing, but we were agreeing in different ways. And it's very interesting. I feel like it's an interesting topic when you talk about, social commentary and horror and what that means. But more so because it's such a long history. It's not some new trend that we've heard about. So, or that I feel like corporate mainstream media kind of pushes like, this is a new thing. Oh my gosh, social commentary horror. That's never been a thing before. And usually I feel like that's sometimes from people who maybe haven't watched too many old horror movies, and maybe their first, induction into it was like something from like 2017, 2016 that was like, overt social commentary. So now it's like, oh my gosh, this is brand new. And it's like, not really, So, what I want to get into Candyman 2021, highlighting some of the pros and cons of it, spoiler free, of course, although I will hint at some things. I won't tell you endings and stuff like that, but kind of an overview, and then using that in comparison to the 1992 Candyman, and then going into a bit more about the of the history of horror as social commentary, the question of woke horror and where this new phrase of woke horror came from, and social justice warrior horror or social justice warrior stuff came from, and what's influencing it, and whether or not the arguments around these things. And then I want to highlight some classic horror movies that are totally, what could be seen in the positive light of woke horror. And then I want to talk about when so-called woke horror is done right, and right, in my opinion, and when it's done wrong, in my opinion, and why. And then talking about horror today and where we're going with it, right? Or where we can go with it, the possibilities and what that means. But this is the thing. No form of entertainment or anything exists in a vacuum, right? So, and I think one of the reasons why I love horror as much as I do is because of the fact that to me, usually some of the best kind of horror does in some way reflect the society we live in, for better or worse. And so that to me is some of the best kinds, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all over your head when you, or bludgeon you over the head with it, once again, another term, when it comes to the messaging. And I think that's where I differ with some people when it comes to, messaging in any movie, honestly, to be honest with you, but particularly in horror, because I do think sometimes, Doug is saying that they revoked my horror card last week. My horror card was not revoked last week. You just didn't agree with my tier list. Some of you didn't agree with my tier list. I still got my horror card. Don't be a hater, Doug. No, I love it. I want to kind of start with that in terms of what we're going to be talking about when it comes to woke horror. And what that means, because it's a layered thing. There's depending on who defines the word will create the definition of the word, especially in these day and age. So that's what I want to talk about too when we talk about woke, which is why I have it in quotes in this thing right here. So Candyman 2021, I don't know how many people have seen it. Once again, I'm not going into deep spoilers of it. I want to just kind of give a bit of a kind of short review of it just in relation to what I want to talk about. So today we are going into Candyman 2021 and the question of woke horror. I feel like the grade that I would give Candyman 2021 would be a B- C+. I didn't love it, but I'm also not someone who thinks that every film that happens to have a predominantly black cast or a predominantly cast of color needs to be like a masterpiece or Academy Award caliber. I'm actually part of the Let Black People Make Mediocre Movies and Be Able to Get Away with It club too, you know, because I think far too often sometimes when you have movies like this where let me explain what I'm saying when I say that. You have movies where there are so many horror movies that are different levels. You got A+ horror movies that are like instant classics. You got the ones that are quite forgettable. You got the cult classics that maybe not everyone loves, but you got a very devoted audience to it. And then you got the ones that, you know, they were good for a popcorn, you know, fest, and then you move away from it. And and a lot of times, and it's not just horror that does this, you know, it's not just horror that does this. I feel like sometimes when you have movies where it is people of color, black people, you know, women who are headlining it, there's this added pressure that the movie itself has to be some type of really super high caliber. And I want to say that I did not go into this film thinking it had to be that. And I say that because I don't want there to be, you know, I don't think there should be a thing of this is a bad movie. It's not. It's not a bad movie. It's actually, you know, it's decent. It's just somewhat, in my opinion, forgettable. In comparison to the 92 version and just as a movie, it's okay. That's what that B- C+ is. It's an okay movie. And for a movie that stands on its own, it's okay. Now, because of the fact, now there is a little bit of added pressure on this though, just because it is in a franchise where the original film was just so haunting and good and mesmerizing that you are going to get that instant thing of, is it allowed to be just okay, right? Because of the fact, it's kind of like the way I was talking about last week about the Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 version. I was like, this wasn't a horrible film. It just wasn't it was like the worst possible Freddy film. You know, if you didn't know Freddy, you would have said, okay, this is all right, I guess, and would have forgot about it. But because it was a Freddy film, it made it bad. It made it even worse. And I do think there's a little bit of that when it comes to this film as well, because it is an okay movie, but it should be better than that. Only because of the fact that you took the time to go back to the Candyman franchise, you know? And I do think this is where you get that added pressure for movies like Halloween and, you know, movies that remake classics and stuff. You're going to have that added pressure. But if I was to minus this movie from the franchise of Candyman, because let's be real, Candyman 2 and 3 probably wasn't that great, if we're being honest. Candyman 1, though, it was amazing. I would say this was okay. It has the blood and the gore to it, but that's not really enough because, you know, to me, what makes a really great horror movie is the story. You know, what draws you in. Of course, you need the scare factor and things like that, but being scared can be subjective, you know, and so when you're not jumping in your seat, sometimes you want to be like, that was just a really, really good story. And I think this film leaned a little too much on trying to it switched up the lore, tried to add to the lore, but also tried to lean on the old lore. It was respectful, as someone said earlier, but it didn't add much to it. You know, it kind of added this new kind of rule with what they ended up doing with it. But that rule, you could have kind of, you know, taken it or left it. You know, and I think when you're doing a film like this, you're going to have the pressure of that, you know. Dark Aster say, I thought it was all right, didn't quite live up to the original, but was good and better than the previous sequels. I don't think the people who made this movie were leaning on that. I think once you get, again, you had the main media kind of jumping on that in a way, right? It was like, oh my gosh, you know, we have a black woman director, we have the Candyman thing, and you know what happened with Candyman. And some of these people who are writing these articles probably didn't even watch Candyman, but I digress. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is going to talk about gentrification. This is going to talk about this. And it's going to be like, an expose on the racial injustice system. And I feel like that also added to this pressure. But funny enough, I would argue this movie had kind of a muddled commentary. This movie had very muddled commentary. Our main protagonist is an artist. He comes from a certain neighborhood and things like that, but he's very much involved in a group of people who, regardless of race, would be seen as gentrifying this neighborhood. And it's never really kind of worked out what that means. They kind of shoehorn in the idea of the bad cops, the racist cops, and police brutality. And that was another thing they kind of pulled up on suddenly, the whole police brutality thing. And I got why. It was because of what's been happening in the world. So that got brought up. But it was a muddled commentary. And honestly, I would argue it was shoehorned in. The commentary isn't really all that there. It's more just a straight up horror picture. That's the funny thing about this movie. It's a straight up, it really leans on the monster aspect of it more than the commentary. The commentary is kind of fluttered throughout, but it's not really it's not the most through line. And when it does talk about gentrification, which is what Jordan Peele, who is the producer of this, and Nia DaCosta, who also directed, was kind of talking about it. It's not really all that overt, actually. And it doesn't really have an exact stance on gentrification as a whole, which is probably because the stance of gentrification can be a muddled topic, if you think about it. The whole idea of more affluent people or people of a different race, usually white, coming into a downtrodden neighborhood, and then suddenly that neighborhood gets a Whole Foods and the rent goes up and people get moved out. You can see that as, oh, that's automatically bad. But then you think, well, it was a downtrodden neighborhood and now all this money is going into it. So isn't that a good thing? So there's a certain kind of not so black and white talk about that. But the movie, if anything, is the most overt, is that in this movie, a gentrification, but it never really takes a stance. The movie never really takes a clear enough stance on it. And then it kind of just leans towards the police brutality. And it's like, okay, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about in this movie? It's an okay movie. But what was so funny was before this movie even came out, there was, from both aisles, people exalting it like it was going to be the second coming of Jesus of horror for some reason. So kind of putting this pressure on it that it wasn't allowed to just be a horror movie. And then you had other people on the other side of this aisle going, oh my gosh, here's another movie vilifying the white man, and and so on and so forth. And it was kind of like, the movie kind of didn't do either of that. But it still got shoehorned into, this is woke horror. Why? Because on the surface, you know, one could argue we might have become a headline reading society. It was like, black people are in this movie. All right, this is woke. You know, oh, it takes place in the projects. This is so woke, you know? And so that's kind of where this whole idea of this new trend of calling things woke horror, or worse, social thrillers, I don't even know what that means, or elevated horror, which I want to talk about a little bit later on, where they start creating these new buzzwords because they don't want to call it horror. Like, horror is like the redheaded stepchild of movies or something in genres. So, you know, and so, you know, it was an okay movie, but it did get thrown into the stance of, this is the woke horror. And I think that was somewhat because of the marketing, if you really think about it, because they did kind of push this idea of, this is going to be about police brutality at the core. And it kind of wasn't. I'm not going to go into many details because I know some people haven't seen it, but I wanted to use that as jumping off point. And, you know, I like clips. So I want to kind of show a clip of the of it.
Kids. One day, a couple of kids get razor blades in their candy.
So this is kind of the new origin that they start talking about, right? Police brutality, right? Straight off the jump.
Hands.
They beat him, tortured him, killed him right there on the spot. A couple weeks later, more razor blades and more candy. He been innocent.
So he's real.
Candyman ain't a he. Candyman's the whole damn hive.
So you see, like, you know, it's a really good trailer. And, you know, one of the things it plays into is the idea of, you know, the police brutality. Candyman isn't just one person anymore. He's a movement. You know, it's very buzzwordy for kind of the times that we are still in 2021. So that's marketing, and that's fine. But I do feel like, in a way, one could argue that kind of marketing somewhat did a disservice to the movie, because it put this pressure on it to suddenly now be more than what it ended up being. And I think that then you had it so it sort of disappointed some people on one part of it, and then other people seeing this automatically dismissed it, right? It was like, oh, here we go, it's a whole movie about this. And it can be said that you're not going to please everyone who watches your movie, no matter what you actually put in the movie, right? I mean, you got some people, like I was saying, they see people of color in a movie and they automatically think it's going to be what they deem as woke, just because of who exists in that film, which it could be the furthest thing from that. But in this particular case, you do have a movie that kind of, or more so, leaned into the idea, even when we saw the interviews with Pill and everything, that it was going to lean into the idea of social commentary, overt social commentary. And unfortunately, I would argue that it had muddled social commentary. And this is what I'm saying about, without getting too much of a spoiler, they made it kind of a movement. It's not just one person, it's many people, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of like, did that add anything to the lore? And I got the whole thing, it's a movement, right? Very much with a lot of stuff that's happening these days, that it's not just one person that gets hurt, whether it's police brutality or violence and stuff. It's a whole group of people. Say their name kind of a deal, right? Say it, right? Say their name, which was a buzzword for the, you know, Sandra Bland and other, particularly it was Black women. That movement started with Black women who had been, you know, hurt by the police and whatnot. And so there was a whole thing of say their name. So you also have this marketing here of say Candyman, right? Because it plays on the idea of say his name. Remember what happened to this person. It very much has all the marketing of the activism and things like that, which I think is fine. But and that's a whole other discussion in a way of how Hollywood kind of plays on the whole thing of, I guess the best example of this would be when, Kendall Jenner, when she did the Pepsi commercial, and like she hands, she's at a protest, and then she hands the police officer a Pepsi. And then suddenly you're supposed to believe, or it seems as though, I don't know, I guess racism is solved because she handed him a Pepsi. Or another commercial where I think it was Calvin Klein jeans, where they were saying Calvin Klein jeans, part of the movement and part of the people being free. Mind you, these kind of jeans are like super expensive, and a lot of people who because of the wealth gap can't even afford these jeans. But yes, it's part of the revolution of the people. You get what I'm saying? And Hollywood does this same thing when it comes to the marketing of certain things to push a certain kind of, you know, idea. Now, I'm not gonna be, you know, it's one of those things like, well, if this upsets you, someone, you know, talking about this thing's a social commentary, then it's not for you anyway. But even at the same time, a movie like this, where you didn't even actually kind of follow through with that, I think you the movie hurt itself more than it helped with that, right? In my opinion. Michael is saying, The mispromotion of Candyman reminds me of the time the promotion of the Joker made people think it was encouraging mass shootings and hate crimes, and then the film wasn't about that at all. Exactly. And this is the thing, because, you know, when mainstream media, when PR and things see something trending, there's a certain kind of bastardization of it, almost, where it kind of sucks the soul out of it to try to push it on you as a product. Now, Candyman 1992 is actually based off of The Forbidden by Clive Barker, Mr. Hellraiser and such himself. And The Forbidden is a short story that deals with more so a class situation. That's what's so funny about this. Even the short story itself had social commentary, right? And it makes sense because Barker is like that in that way. So the Forbidden deals with the idea of a class society. It happens I think it happens in Britain. And I'm actually reading, I want to read the description of it. It's a story about urban legends come to life of a downtrodden. This is via Dave and Spooky Reads. Want to give credit to my resources. And basically it deals with the dilapidated housing estate, which it's what ended up being the situation in Candyman, a dilapidated housing estate, and basically this entity that happens. And, you know, the Be My Victim is actually one of the iconic lines in the movie, is actually also in The Forbidden, actually comes from The Forbidden as well, because I also want to talk about messaging in film. Every movie has a message in it, whether it's pushing the status quo at you or whether it's pushing something new, whether it's going against the status quo. Every movie has some form of, I'm going to use a word that makes people ruffle their feathers. Everything you have in it has propaganda. Propaganda doesn't have to necessarily be a bad term, but everything you watch, everything you take in has propaganda. Propaganda being an idea that the person who created the thing you are consuming would like you to believe. Everything has some form of a slant in it, even in the news. And so does horror movies. A lot of times people don't call something propaganda unless they disagree with it. That's funny, right? Take that in. People usually don't call something propaganda unless they don't agree with it. If they agree with it, then it's the facts. It's just how things are. Oh, this is a regular movie because I agree with everything that's happening. And oh, that's just a regular movie. As soon as a movie has some kind of messaging people don't like, it's like, oh my gosh, here's this. And instead, I will argue that instead of calling it propaganda, it's gotten to be called woke by the people, the negative formation of woke by the people who don't necessarily agree with what they think is in the film. So then we have Candyman 1992. It's just, I mean, we have Tony Todd, who is a horror legend. We love him. We love Tony Todd here. And now I want to show a scene from Candyman 1992, which once again, it still had the class commentary with the dilapidated buildings in Chicago, the projects of Chicago, and also the actual situation of race, right? And kind of the difference of the vibe of this movie, yet it's chock full of so much in there with everything that it tries to say. One more. And then it's that. And that's what makes that land. Because that build up to this moment.
You're mine now.
And then it's him. Oh my gosh, it's him. And Smug is saying, I don't necessarily agree that every movie has a message, but I do think that most movies will have themes of some kind. And not all themes are necessarily political. Most of them can just be about things as abstract as love, friendship, death, etc. I get that, and this is kind of my argument for that. And this is where I differ, I guess, with some people. I think everything's political. I actually do think everything's political. I think, I think people could agree with me on this, because if you think about what political means, right, there has been a push to make us think that what's politics is what happens on Capitol Hill. It's this law that gets passed. It's this thing that's away from us, away from you, and it's just kind of out there on Capitol Hill. And what are those people doing on Capitol Hill? And it's kind of that political theater that we see on television. But one can argue that everything's political, from the kind of work you feel compelled to do, your wages, the kind of relationships that are shunned, considered taboo, the ones that are exalted, whether or not you choose to have kids. I mean, look, the Pope just recently made a whole thing about people who choose to not have kids and just have pets are selfish, and so far. That's political. All of those things influence society. Society is politicized. It's just that we think of political as being a candidate. We think of political as being some law that's passed, when in reality, it's kind of, I forget the exact title, during, I believe, the second wave of feminism, where it was like the personal is the political, where women, and trying to choose the right to what was going on with their body and so on and so forth, which should have been a personal thing, it was still political. And so it's like there's a blurred line, because it all happens to kind of affect everything. And I think there's kind of this weird thing where we think at times that when something's political or overtly political, because it talks about some particular candidate or party or whatever, that that's the thing, and that's where the buck ends. But it's all connected, in that regard. So in that sense, I do think a lot of things have messaging in them, even if it isn't overt. If someone has the idea that, let's say you have a movie where there's no gay couple in it, all the regular main couples are, heterosexual. And one could argue that the message that's being sent there is that the norm, the default, is heteronormative relationships. Now, they didn't say anything against gay people. They didn't say gay is wrong or anything like that. But there is, by de facto of what's being shown on screen, showing you what is normalized, what is the status quo necessarily. So that's kind of where I come from when I think of what goes on in movies. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about the whole idea of propaganda and how it gets a negative term, usually probably because of George Orwell's 1984, where it was like the whole idea is that tell a lie enough times it becomes the truth, and so on and so forth. And where propaganda, the term propaganda, and of course with the Nazis, the term propaganda, I hope I don't get turned off for saying Nazis. The term propaganda got a negative connotation, when in reality the definition is simply something pushing the idea by the person who created it and hoping you kind of get this idea. We got terms like special snowflake, social justice warrior, aka SJW, the idea of woke, you gotta be woke. And I would argue that depending on who's defining that term, it can be seen as negative or positive, right? And this is the same thing with horror. With Candyman 2021, I saw comments like, oh my gosh, another woke horror movie that's just going to be trying to throw something at me, and so on and so forth. I also saw this with other films, some good, some bad, and TV shows. And so I want to argue that depending on who says it, that determines whether or not it's considered positive. I honestly, at this point, because of the fact that the word woke has kind of been taken over, and everyone and their mother has a hot take on something that doesn't always need a hot take, and I'm just saying, as someone who works in journalism, where I get that sometimes, where someone always has to write a new article about something that sometimes doesn't need an article. infusing certain thoughts about it that maybe didn't need to get thought about that deep. And so I got tired of the word woke, but only because of what it ends up being seen as, right? Because one can argue on the positive side of woke, one can argue that it simply means it plays into progressive ideals, what some people would consider progressive, whether it be same-sex marriage, people of color being main characters and not the first person killed off. I'm talking about in horror and things, or just other outlets, the commercials you see. You got people complaining nowadays that they see too many interracial couples or people of color in cereal commercials. They call that woke. They call a Cheerios commercial because it's a black family woke. Oh my gosh, I literally saw that comment the other day, y'all, where there's like, what's up with this woke Cheerios commercial, right? So, one could argue that on the positive side, it is the progressive ideal of inclusion, of diversity, things like that. And then on the negative side of that, one could argue that it's the pushing of an agenda on someone. It's the idea of vilifying anyone who, for some people, I'm not saying this is my opinion, but like for some people, it's like, oh, it vilifies white people. It vilifies all white people, or it vilifies heteronormative people or heterosexuals. Oh my gosh, you're wrong to be straight anymore, and so on and so forth. So there's these negative connotations. And then on top of that, you have the people who, there's two sides of that as well, right? You have the idea that sometimes some things are, I would argue, too woke in the cringe side of it, right? In the sense of it's not a good story. You're throwing a whole bunch of stuff at me, and because you're claiming that this is woke, I'm not allowed, as someone who is considered progressive, to dislike it, because if I dislike this thing, I must be against the messaging in it. Which I think that's where it gets murky, where you're not allowed to dislike something because of the overt messaging in it, because it's automatically seen as, if you dislike it, you must dislike the overt messaging that's in it. And I think that's where it gets murky, because there are people who genuinely do dislike the overt message in it, and they'll dislike it even if the movie is good. Those are those people who are going to dismiss it no matter what. Then there are people who, maybe they dislike the movie itself, but because they said it out loud, they get called something else because, like there were two sides of the aisle when it came to the Captain Marvel movie, right? There were people who genuinely just disliked it because it was a so-so movie. And then there were trolls, right? Who disliked it because of Brie Larson and the things she said about feminism and things like that. They weren't going to give this movie a chance, but they leaned on, oh, this is woke, when it literally was just another version of Captain America, in my opinion. And there's those of us who thought, okay, this is kind of a mid-tier thing, but I'm all for a woman being in the lead. I just don't particularly care for this. You know what I mean? See what some of y'all are saying. Jorge is saying, woke ended up adapting a negative connotation for trying too hard to look for wrongs. I think that's one of the ideas of it. I agree. But then on the other scale of that, there are some movies that they lean on it so much to say, well, you have to watch this film because it has this person in it. So you have to support it, don't you? And it's like, well, I don't have to support it. I mean, is it good? It's not just about the messaging. Is it good? And that's what I want to, talk about too with this. And this is what I mean. I use this example of Candyman 2021 and Candyman 1992, where one could argue in the positive sense, both of these are woke movies because they play on the idea of race and class and other things. One just does it way better, and just because I didn't care for Candyman 2021 doesn't mean I disagree with the message. It just means one wasn't written or done as well as the other around it, the negatives and the positives. And I would argue that the media, and I also agree with that, both extreme sides are annoying as F, if you ask me. I don't think you're wrong. Both of the extreme sides, I would argue, when it comes to this whole woke debate, for the most part. But I would argue that mainstream media also played a big part in this whole conversation around woke horror. Right? Because what you started having, particularly, we're going to talk about this movie, right? Particularly when Get Out came out. It was a good movie. Get Out is a great movie. Prefacing that, I think it's smart. I think it holds a mirror to society and to certain segments of society so well. It's so smart. It's an example of when it comes together, when a good storytelling, great characters, and messaging comes together. And it's a little bit more overt than total subtext, right? Because sometimes you got stuff and messaging where it's very subtle, and then you have the ones that are a little bit more overt, and they still do well. This is an example of that. This is a movie that has a little bit more of an overt message, but it does it well. Why? In my opinion, because it has a great story. And so I think we started getting more stuff that wanted to be like Get Out, but kind of missed the point at the heart of Get Out, which was you got to still make it entertaining.
Apparently, a whole bunch of brothers been missing in this suburb. But it's cool. Bro, how you not scared of this, man?
Good to see another brother around here.
Good to see another brother.
Chris was just telling me I felt much more comfortable with my being here.
Uh-oh.
Yo, sorry, man.
Get out! Yo!
Rose, we gotta go.
Is everything okay?
Okay, so I want to kind of go into, the whole idea of horror with messaging. And I believe horror has always had messaging in it. Whether it's, pushing the status quo of horror or, whether it is the idea of something against the status quo. I think this was said on Swaddle by Ravi Desi, a really good article about propaganda. And it says the example of propaganda is a form of persuasion used to influence people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And I think we can argue that a lot of stuff kind of is that, ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. And I think that's key there because, there is kind of this mentality, like I was saying, when it comes to the idea of woke, when it comes to social justice warrior and so on and so forth, that we use the term woke. When we hear it used in a negative sense, it's usually someone that doesn't agree with what they think they're going to, be presented with, Good thing you brought that up, Smug, because I actually have it in my notes to talk about that one too, but I can talk about it here. I think Antebellum and them, I actually have a video on the YouTube about them. I have a review. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the response to that review under this whole umbrella of woke horror. Get Out is a great example of, I don't want to call it lightning in a bottle because we've seen it before. There are a lot of other horror movies that have done this, even from the 1960s and so on and so forth. It was done well. It was a good story. Then what you have, which is something that Hollywood often does, is this kind of, this did well. Let's make more of those. Can you make more of that? That's the hot trending thing right now. And a lot of time it's executed really poorly. And I think that's what you got with Antebellum. That's definitely what you got with them. I literally sat through I think it was 10 episodes of them. 10 episodes I will not get back of what I considered race torture. Because it missed the point of Get Out. It missed the idea of, a message and was just like, well, this is the thing that happens. Let's just show a lot of it. And that's what happened in Antebellum and Get Out. And I think that's what happens when you get that kind of backlash against a movie like that. I don't want to say they ruin it for other movies, but that's when you start getting stuff like that tells you this is going to be so woke or whatever. And it's not really woke at all. It's just kind of, in the positive sense, it's really just using the idea of Black trauma to say this is horror. Yes, it's horrible. Black trauma is very horrible. But when you do it in the way that they were doing, it was very exploitative, and it missed the mark of not really having a message, if you think about it. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to horror today, but that's honestly my opinion on those, and that's what I mean when I say it can go terribly, terribly wrong. So, you know, what you had, like, for example, pre-code horror, which was before the Hays Code and when motion pictures got sound and stuff like that and they started regulating. Horror, the genre of horror has always pushed the envelope. It's always done that. It's always pushed the envelope in the sense of, you know, what it's tried to do, whether it's the gore, whether it's, you know, those things like that. It's always kind of pushed that kind of, those kind of just kind of either pushing the morbid, some things that make people disgruntled, not always social commentary per se, but kind of pushing the envelope. And I think you have a lot of movies that have come out that very much do that as well. So I want to kind of give example of some classics that maybe some people know them as being ones that have social commentary in them, and maybe they're not as overt with what the social commentary is Night of the Living Dead, right? Came out 1968, a black male lead, and, you know, this was that George Romero, you know, classic. And I mean, this is one of the ones that started the zombie genre, and the idea of the zombie in many zombie movies, I would argue, usually always has some kind of symbolism for what the zombie represents, whether it's the breakdown of society, whether it's a distrust of others, and so on and so forth. A lot of zombie movies, when done right, in my opinion, usually have it so that they have the zombies usually represent something. Just like people argued back in the day that Dracula represented syphilis, or, like, you know, unprotected sex and all this other stuff and debauchery. Yes, people did think Dracula represented that. The same thing can be said for zombies in certain degree, but more so with this particular one, what you had was a black male lead, and, you know, he basically survives to the very end of the film. He beats the zombie. He survives at the very end of the film. And you know how he ends up dying? The police shoot him. He gets shot. I think it was the police, or just these two white dudes. It was either the police or these two random guys. But he basically ends up getting shot by humans. Two white guys. I believe it was the police. But it's a very poignant moment, you know, to make it through what is could seem like a zombie apocalypse, and then to, as a black man, that not being the most dangerous thing he has to deal with. Another one is They Live, one of my favorite movies. And They Live, as John Carpenter put it, was an FU to Ronald Reagan. Because of dealing with the growing poverty that was going on in society, the fact that it was dealing with the wealth gap, it was dealing with poverty, it was dealing with propaganda in the sense of negative propaganda of obey, of who you should listen to. Because during the Reagan era, you had the busting up of union labor. You had the idea of, you know, the whole so-called welfare queen that vilified black women who were getting government assistance with children, when in reality, even up to today, the majority of people who happen to be on welfare are single white men. That's the real statistics of it. But Reagan was part of pushing the idea that it was black women with a whole bunch of babies and things like that. So things like that were really poignant in this film. As Doug is pointing out, one of the best things, I'm here to chew bubble gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubble gum. We dig it. And so you had the awesome Keith David, just I mean, he's also a legend. Gargoyles, hello, Keith David, we love him. Wonderful voice. And of course, the man himself in there. And, it was talking about Reaganomics, the idea of the trickle-down system. I actually wrote an article about They Live. And it was dealing with, the idea that there were lower taxes for the rich, that it was okay to not tax the rich as much because the money that the rich made was going to trickle down to the poor. And we know now, even though they continue to try to push the trickle down system, that's not true. That's not how it works. Usually wealthy people who get more wealth or bosses just kind of keep their money to themselves. The People Under the Stairs, which I think is another example of a very good middle ground. This was by Wes Craven, another one of my favorite films. Let me know in the chat if you've seen it. But People Under the Stairs is one of my favorite films, and it's brutal. It's a brutal film. It's a lot of action, but it says a lot. There's a lot being said with some of the things that are happening with mommy and daddy, the characters mommy and daddy, who are like top level horror villains, if you ask me. And people, critics and stuff once called it that it was kind of a play like Mommy and Daddy. One critic called it an extreme version of Nancy and Ronald Reagan, of conservatism. There's the whole idea of the forgotten people under the stairs, the exploitation, the racism, things like that, and the prejudice against inner city people, things like that. And so it's such a quality film. And I feel like it still holds up because of what it was trying to do in terms of a good film. And it keeps you on the edge of your seat. And this is another example of, I would argue, this is one of those films that unless you really kind of knew the references, you might not know that it's saying, you might not realize that it's saying something. You may look at the characters of Mommy and Daddy, which is the white couple in the film who are being abusive and things like that. You might just see them as cuckoo for Cocoa Puff types. But in reality, they are representations of certain kind of characteristics of American society. I want to actually show a clip of People Under the Stairs because it's awesome.
The police never took it serious.
She's been feeding that thing between the
Mommy and Daddy.
Very, very tense about this.
What goes on in this house is a sin. But what goes on under the stairs is a nightmare. Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs.
Another one that's also has social commentary in it, for sure, but people probably, once again, may not see that it is because of the way the movie is done. So unless you're looking out for it, you might not peep it, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, this one by Toby Hopper, one of my faves, another one of my faves. As you probably will know, the things I'm picking are the ones I absolutely love that are social commentary, but they're also classics. You may think this is just about a weird old family, a weird old family living in some backwards town, quote unquote, and they kill people. And eat them or whatever, and just basically kill people and they just get off on it. And you may think that's all this movie is about, right? And it's totally not just what this movie is about. I mean, there's a part of that. And that's great because it's so haunting. But there's other layers of this. The idea of the radio playing and telling you things plays on the idea of the media being misleading, telling you things, the whole idea of the Vietnam War, because a lot of people were hearing about the Vietnam War via the media, and what they were being told was going on there wasn't necessarily what was going on there. The question of people, these backwards people that they are being presented as, was an extreme form of what happens when companies leave town. Companies big companies leave towns and leave towns desolate. Such as meatpacking towns. You had towns that were dependent on meatpacking, or like Campbell's Soup in New Jersey and Camden. I know that because I'm from Jersey. And when these companies leave for either sending their labor somewhere else so they could pay those people less, and so on and so forth, towns are destitute. And what happens when people become destitute? Yeah, they end up moving, they end up staying and becoming poor. And then one could argue that the family that we see in Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an extreme version of the depravity that can come out. And what's so funny about that is with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I honestly think it's one of those films that if you didn't look a little bit more at it, you might not pick up on those things. Because I've seen people who have said, they'll say something like, oh, I'm inspired by Texas Chainsaw Massacre when I, made this thing. And, I'll look at maybe what they made or whatever. And it's really just a lot of violence and just like obscenity and stuff. And it's like, no, I don't think you're that inspired by Texas Chainsaw, because I think you maybe had missed that there's a bit more to just the violence in there, right? And I think many people can miss that. And that's not to say anyone's like less intelligent or anything like that, but sometimes this is another example of a film that doesn't do it overtly, but tells a story within it. Body Snatchers, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, both the 1956 one and the 1978 one. I believe there was a 1990-something one. I think there's probably another one. They always redo this movie. And it's so funny about this movie because depending on who makes the film or who makes the remake of this, the commentary always changes. I think that's always funny about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Kind of like the same thing about wokeness and things, about depending on who's telling you it changes. Like the 1956 one is debatable. Some people think it's against McCarthyism, which was this whole idea of a witch hunt against those who were left-leaning, communists, things like that. And some people think it was for McCarthyism, kind of playing on the idea of you don't know these people. They could be Russian spies. That's the debate about the 1956 one. And the 1978 one took place in San Francisco, and that's a debate about what the politics behind that one is. And so I think that's very interesting, which shows that here's the crux of a horror story. What if these alien extraterrestrial beings came from outer space and basically took over people's bodies? But depending on who's telling the story, the political undertones of it can completely change. Is it about McCarthyism? Is it against McCarthyism? Or is it against left-leaning propaganda and so on and so forth? Which was brought up earlier is Black Christmas, but this is the 1974 one, right? Now, I think it's important to bring up Black Christmas because we've had remakes of Black Christmas very recently. One in particular, the 2019 version, which did not do very well. And I think this is once again another example of when someone takes something thinking they're infusing it with something new that's never been done before and not realizing that maybe the thing they're doing has been done before, even more directly so as in the actual movie they're remaking. Black Christmas 1974 is, well, I would argue maybe was a little bit ahead of its time when it came to movies dominated by women in a house and it not being exploitative or overly sexualized with them. Now, we saw a lot of movies after that had the same kind, and this is once again of how, depending on who's making it, how it changes. You had a lot of other movies that were similar setups to there's a killer in the house, they're trying to kill the girls, they have some underlying thing, and who knows what it's about. And a lot of times, a lot of those types of movies were kind of an excuse to show a lot of breast, right? There were a lot of excuses just to show the boobies or show people having sex and so on and so forth. This movie, though, talks about abortion. It talks about, independence outside of a relationship, things like that. And it has very smart characters, interesting characters, And so, it's a good example of a film that 1974 was quite ahead of its time in terms of what it was showing and how it showed groups of girls without being exploitative or over-sexualizing them. But you would never know that because maybe the people that made the remakes, or maybe the 2019 one, it was like, yeah, girl power. But the 1974 one had the 1974 one had girl power too. But it was a lot more subtle, and it leaned more on the story and the scares more than whatever it was trying to tell you about. And so you still got a story that had a very strong woman cast. I mean, you had the original Lois Lane up in here. I mean, hello. And others. And it does well in being one of the top kind of movies where you have a majority girl cast in like a sorority or something like that, or a boarding school. And it's not just a way to have them show their breasts the whole time, right? Like, how creepy is that? Someone standing back there, bag over the face.
A high school girl's been murdered. Mr. Harrison's daughter is missing. And now at the house where she lives, the other girls are getting obscene phone calls.
Yeah, what I've done is I've tapped his phone so that when it rings...
And they make it so the call is so chilling. Every time they get a call, it's like, who's going to be on the other end? What's this guy? And it also plays on the fact that you had it so people were making prank calls back. The people were saying, back in the day when a lot more people had landlines, you had people calling, breathing on the phone. And especially if you were a woman, you could deal with a lot of obscene phone calls and things like that, being harassed. So it also brings that into it as well. Another one is the Crazies. Another George Romero, because George Romero is awesome, or was awesome, God rest his dead, of 1973. The Crazies dealt with humans in crisis, a government that, the whole idea that the government's not helping you, social collapse. There's been remakes of the Crazies, definitely not as poignant. And it was just a movie that, it's a hectic movie, y'all. It's so frenzied, the Crazies. And you would almost kind of, once again, another one where you might kind of miss that there's commentary going on, but there's definitely commentary going on. Cat People, back in 1942, that the undertone going on in Cat People dealt with lesbianism. A woman who thinks that she might be a shapeshifter into a cat. Every time she gets aroused or angry, she's resistant to marrying her husband. There's kind of some sort of going on with her and other women that's very subtle. This was closer to the pre-code type era type thing, but you get that. That's 1942, where there's like a queer undertone going on in a film. Tales from the Hood. Another one, where, which was also mentioned earlier, where it had messaging in it. This one was a bit more overt with the messaging, for sure. And also you had it so there was a representation of Black horror going on in there, and not in a race torture kind of way. And it just, it's a classic. Can't say much for the sequels, but the Tales from the Hood, 1995 is definitely a classic. And then, of course, you had Hellraiser, that dealt with the idea of sexual repression and taboos. So, what I'm saying here is that we've always had horror that has messaging in it of some kind. Whether you see it or not, it's very much there. But we do have a negative connotation where it can get cringy, it can get weird, and I am not one of those people. I'm going to say it right here. I'm not one of those people that believe just because something might have a better message in it that it should always get a pass as being seen as, oh my gosh, everyone has to support this thing because it has this in it or that. Like, I think you still need to prove that it's a good piece. Smug is saying social commentary horror is what I might call this subgenre. But see, that's what I mean when I say it gets kind of weird when we have to label it, though, because would someone call Texas Chainsaw Massacre social commentary horror? It totally has social commentary in it. Would we call the Crazies that? We probably wouldn't. It's this new phenomenon of having to feel like we have to label it or call it something different than just a horror movie, that we feel compelled to say it's something different, as though horror hasn't been doing that. Like, They Live, social commentary, but it's still a horror movie, right? And so the question is some horror movies just too on the nose? I would argue that some are too on the nose, but I don't think we can dismiss all of movies that have social commentary as being somehow against what horror has always been about, because a lot of horror has always had social commentary in it. The key there is the story. The story is the key. And we've seen in cases where it's done right? So I think it's when it can be done well. And then we have examples when it's not done well at all, and there are problems with that. And one in particular, which many of you might know about, is this one, Karen. Now, Karen was a 2021 film, came out, it was by BET, which is a whole nother story, and it played on something else that was also happening in our society, which, and I love the name of this because it's my mom's namesake. My mom is named Karen, y'all. And so, it played on, the stereotype of Karen, of a Karen, and what a Karen is. And it was just bad. It was just bad. Now, maybe they could have done this in a way that was smarter or something, but it was done so, just so on the nose.
Tell me about your new neighbors.
They're black. Do you mind keeping it down? If you don't comply, I'll tell the manager.
They're black.
Home security serious.
Hi, I am Karen Drexler. I'm your neighbor.
You need to be taking your trash cans off the curb right when the trash is picked up.
Is she nice?
Yeah, she's nice.
Wait a minute. We have a white entitled neighbor named Karen.
Karen, okay, enjoy yourself.
There she is, slaving away in the kitchen.
There she is, slaving away.
Suspecting teenagers.
Suspecting?
Can you please hurry up? Please, they're very aggressive. Yep.
I left my wallet with my ID at home. Leave us alone. We didn't do anything.
How the heck did you end up moving to this neighborhood? Next thing you know, we have criminals. You take care of him, and I will take care of her.
Would you mind stepping out of the car?
My office has uncovered some disturbing information on her and her brother.
Uh-oh.
She doesn't like black people.
We have a search warrant.
Well, I'm black. I know, she doesn't
like you either. Can we talk about this? And it's like, I can understand if it was a parody, but I think they took themselves seriously with this movie. And I think this is an example of the woke thing, the cringe version of woke gone wrong. This is like the height of it right here. And unfortunately, movies that have a lot more to say and aren't like this, like a Get Out and others, get lumped into movies like this, y'all. So what it comes down to, I think, is the idea of telling a good story, period. There's this whole question that started coming out of the whole get woke, go broke. And as you see, the top part of that is a Star Wars kind of font, because a lot of that saying started coming from with the newer Star Wars movies, where you had a lot of, I guess, fanboys or whatnot who were mad at the direction they thought the franchise was going in, and maybe a decentering of the male characters. And so it was this whole idea of like, you get woke, you're gonna go broke because no one's gonna see your film. But that's also not true, right? That's just not true. Get Out made a lot of money. I was going to say Us, but Us isn't as overtly a social commentary, actually. But there's a lot of movies that have social commentary in them that are way more overt, that do well. And then occasionally you get a Karen, or better or worse. And occasionally you get a Them. And occasionally you get an Antebellum. And then sometimes you get the mid-tier movies like Candyman 2021. But it also still did do well in the theater. So this whole idea of get woke, go broke is... Well, one, it's a misleading slogan, but because of what woke may mean to certain people, but it also is like the idea of it's going to make money if it's a good enough story, and that's what it comes down to. It comes down to the story on both ends. At the end of the day, you got to tell a good story. It doesn't really matter if it's woke or not. If it's a good story, people will either dig it or not. Now, yes, there are some stuff that if it's blatantly like racist or sexist, that's going to turn a lot of people off. But we did see in the 1980s with the slasher flicks, which, let's be real, had a lot of morality pushing in it, where the virgins got to live, the people who weren't virgins and did drugs died. One could argue that was kind of conservative, leanings in those things, even though it was slashers, and the women were very much overly sexualized and everything, but still made money, and some of those stories weren't even very good, but entertainment, that's where it comes down to. But I think when it comes to the idea of, when you have a message in your film, that as long as it's entertaining and it does well enough in telling a story, I think you can attract some people who may not even agree with your message to maybe take something in from it versus not. But yeah, y'all, that's kind of my overall thoughts. Let me know if you have other movie examples of what you think when social commentary horror is done well. And also, what other ones do you know that you think it's kind of an example of when it's done wrong? I'd love to know. Let me know. Comment. And I just love diving into these stories for sure.